Olá pessoal, tudo bem? Eu sou Samuel Possebon, editor da Teletime, como vocês já sabem. A gente está aqui com mais uma edição do Teletime Live, hoje uma edição especial em que a gente está fazendo um programa que vai ficar disponível para todos os nossos leitores, os nossos ouvintes e a nossa audiência depois do evento Educação Conectada, que a gente está realizando em Brasília. O primeiro evento que a gente faz para discutir a questão de conectividade em escolas, e é um assunto que a gente considera extremamente relevante de ser debatido, principalmente no ambiente em que a gente tem políticas públicas de educação sendo desenvolvidas com foco especificamente em conectar escolas e em conectar estudantes. Então, quanto mais experiências internacionais a gente puder agregar nesse debate, melhor a gente vai ter as operadoras entendendo o problema, o governo entendendo o problema e as políticas públicas bem definidas. A gente vai começar essa nossa conversa de hoje com o Ivan Marwell. O Ivan é CEO da Education SuperHighway, é uma iniciativa norte-americana que teve o propósito de conectar escolas durante os seus primeiros 8 anos de projeto, e foi um projeto extremamente exitoso. Eles cumpriram essa missão, eles já estão numa segunda fase agora, que é garantir com que os estudantes tenham acesso à conectividade fora da escola também, mas a gente vai ficar focado na primeira parte do projeto. Então, eu vou convidar o Ivan para ele entrar na nossa discussão agora. Ivan, thank you very much for your participation. We are switching to English now, but hopefully we can have subtitles for our audience here in Brazil. So let's start with your background, and I will ask you to explain a little bit about Education SuperHighway. What is this initiative? What is the story behind Education SuperHighway?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. And it's fantastic that Brazil is taking the issue of connecting schools so seriously, because it truly has been a game changer for education in America. And I think, seeing Brazil focus on this issue is going to result in great benefits for your students. So as you said, my name is Evan Marwell. I'm the CEO and founder of Education SuperHighway. I founded the organization in 2012. Our mission at the time was to put high-speed broadband in every public school classroom in America. When we started, only 10% of the schools in America actually had high-speed broadband. And when we talk about high-speed broadband, what we meant was they had a fiber optic connection to the building, they had Wi-Fi that reached every classroom, and they had at least 100 kilobits per student and staff of internet access. And if they achieved those three things, that meant that they had sufficient internet to actually be able to use the internet for teaching and learning in their classrooms. So that was the mission of the organization. Only 10% of schools had enough bandwidth to use internet for teaching and learning. And today, 99.7% of classrooms in America meet those standards. And in fact, we've really gone far beyond those standards, and we've raised it from 100 kilobits per student to 1 megabit per student. And over half the classrooms in America today already have over 1 megabit per student. So there's been a huge success and a huge amount of investment. My own background is I was a business guy. I started off as a management consultant. I was the son of 2 educators, which is why I cared a lot about this issue. Education had opened all the doors in my life of opportunity. That is how I went from where I started life to where I am today. And I started as a management consultant, and then I was an entrepreneur 3 times in the telecommunications space, in the software space, and in the finance space. And then I founded Education SuperHighway. So my journey has been one of really being an entrepreneur, finding problems to solve. And the last problem I decided to help solve was the problem of connecting all the schools in America.
You mentioned that you found the initiative Education SuperHighway, and you had some benchmarks that you're trying to achieve. Who decided what was broadband and what was enough broadband for a school? It was a public definition, a government definition, or it was something that you studied and you decided that those would be good benchmarks to reach?
Yeah, ultimately, it was a decision by the Federal Communications Commission in America, which is the primary regulator of the telecom industry here. But they went through a process of soliciting input from, stakeholders across the spectrum. And we were one of those stakeholders. And we originally had a slightly different view. Our view was initially that every school should have at least 100 megabits of internet access coming to it, as well as the other things that we talked about. But there was consensus that built around having a short-term goal of 100 kilobits per student and a longer-term goal of a megabit per student. And so we got behind that, and that's ultimately what the Federal Communications Commission adopted.
And what kind of steps did you take to guarantee that you could reach this benchmarks? What kind of initiatives have you promoted to connect schools?
Yeah. So when we got started, there were a series of problems that we figured out had to be overcome. The first problem was an awareness problem and an information problem. So most people in America thought that all of our schools had good internet, and in fact, they didn't. So the first thing we had to do is explain to people that actually, no, our schools don't all have good internet. So, and then people were like, well, of course, this is a problem we have to solve. Or every other part of life today involves the internet. How can we not be making that available in our schools?
We're talking about something that happened 8 years ago, right?
8 years ago. Exactly.
And broadband was relevant at that time.
Broadband was super relevant at that time. I mean, you couldn't imagine. So we're talking 2012, entertainment had changed, shopping had changed, finance had changed, the way we traded stocks had changed, like everything had changed, right? Except education. Well, maybe the government hadn't really changed yet either in terms of going digital, but other than those two sectors, pretty much everything else, if you didn't have good internet products and services and the ability to interact with your customers, you were behind and you were going to lose. So the first problem was awareness. The second problem was identifying where the problem was and being able to figure out, okay, which schools actually needed to be upgraded and what were the upgrades that they needed. Some schools had fiber, but they didn't have good Wi-Fi. Some schools had fiber, but they didn't have enough internet access, and so on and so on. So we had to figure that out. The third problem was that there was a real deficit of technical expertise in the schools themselves. So they didn't really know what to do, right? They didn't know who to buy from. They didn't know what they should buy. They didn't know, how to go about doing it. And so we had to solve that problem. And then the fourth problem was that we weren't using the funds that the government was making available through a program called E-rate effectively. We were spending almost 40% of those funds on phone service instead of internet access. Why? Because when the funds were first created, how'd you get online? You got online through dial-up. Well, we needed to stop doing that and make a bunch of other changes to the policy. So if you look at what we did to solve the problem, the first thing we did was collect data on every school and what they had and what they needed. The second thing we did was we got the policy aligned so that the funding would go to the right places for the right things. And then the third thing we did is we made it really easy for schools to upgrade. And we did that by creating a public-private partnership with internet service providers. It turned out that this was a tremendous business opportunity for internet service providers because of all the federal funding that became available. But they and the schools didn't know how to talk to each other and didn't know how to negotiate over the right things. And so that was really, at the end of the day, one of the most important roles that we played, which was helping make that market between the ISPs and the schools. And one of the most important things that we did to make that market was be very clear about two things. One, for the schools, we got really clear about what their goal was. What they needed fiber to their school building. They needed Wi-Fi in every classroom, and they needed at least 100 kilobits per student, now a megabit per student of internet access. And to the ISPs, what we made really clear was, look, there's a certain amount of money out there, and we all know that once you have the connection into the school building, whether you give the school 100 megabits or 10 gigabits, it doesn't really cost you any different. And so what you need to do is give more bandwidth for the money that's available, and then everyone can be a winner.
So that was the kind of adjustment that the operators, the ISPs, had to do. They were not obligated, they were not forced to provide connectivity. They were paid for this, but they in some way they understood that they could provide a good service or a better service for the same price or for the funds that were available.
Exactly. And over the course of the 7 years that we worked on this problem, we saw the price per megabit go down 90% for schools. So they were effectively getting 10 times as much bandwidth as for the same price. But we saw the revenue for the ISPs go up dramatically.
And why was that? The schools were hiring, were demanding more connectivity, were paying more for this? How the business case worked?
Well, so part of what happened is the federal government in the US invested more money. So they went from $1.4 billion a year of investment to almost $4 billion a year of investment. Part of it was that the ISPs said, okay, once we get these connections in place, it really doesn't cost us a lot more to make the connection more faster or slower. So let's make it faster. And they did that in part for competitive reasons, right? Because someone else was going to make it a lot faster if they didn't, right? And then the third thing was that, yeah, there was more money available in schools. Now that they understood what they needed, they were willing to spend more money. And so I think the total revenue to ISPs went from something like, about, let's call it $1 billion a year to close to $2 billion a year in the US.
And the ISPs, were they allowed to also to sell added services such as I don't know, partnership with educational platforms or Google Education Services or any other services that are available for a school? Could they provide these services to the schools?
Yeah, they were more than welcome to do that. They couldn't use federal funds to pay for those things. And generally what we've seen in the US is that the ISPs have not really been the ones who sell those services. They're the ones providing the pipes and the bandwidth. Sometimes they're the ones putting in the Wi-Fi and providing a managed service for that. But usually what we see is that there are other private companies and nonprofits and others who provide the actual educational software.
You mentioned that there was an effort to understand where the connectivity was available, what were the gaps of connectivity that you have. Was it necessary to build new networks to reach the schools, or everything was there? It's just a matter of matchmaking and making these schools contract the services?
No, we had about 23,000 schools, which was about a third of the schools in America that did not have a fiber optic connection. And so one of the most important things that we did was identify those schools and then work with them and work with ISPs to get fiber built to those schools. In some cases where fiber wasn't practical, we would use microwave or other wireless technologies, but high capacity wireless technologies. And, as I think about what Brazil is doing with putting all these various funds available, things like funds from the 5G auction, which are one-time sources of funds, a great way to use that dollars is to get the infrastructure built. Because once the infrastructure is built, you can grow, you can meet the needs of students and teachers as they find more and more ways to use the internet. And so one-time dollars, I would really encourage to be used for building the infrastructure, whereas the recurring dollars should be used to pay for the annual and monthly fees that are needed
for the service. Considering that the first phase of your initiative is completed, you have pretty much all these schools in America connected. You're now entering the second phase, which is subsidizing the services for poor students so they can have access at home. How is it working, and is it the same principle that you have for the first phase?
Yeah, so our 2.0 mission, as we like to say, is to close the digital divide at home the way we close the digital divide at schools, right? And in the US, it may be hard to believe, but 25% of the households in the US don't have internet at home. About 7 million of them, or about a third of those 25%, don't have it because there's no infrastructure. They live in rural America where there's no infrastructure available. But 2/3 of it, almost 18 million households, don't have it, not because there's no infrastructure, but because they can't afford it. And so once again, it's a very similar playbook. We have to identify who's not connected. We have to get the government policy in place to pay for the internet, just like they did with schools. And then we have to make it easy for them to get connected, just like we made it easy for schools to get connected. And so the good news is we're now working with ISPs. We have a partnership with over 100 ISPs, including all of the big ones in the US, to help us identify which households do and don't have internet. The US government has now put up $85 billion as part of our infrastructure bill and COVID relief work to build infrastructure to the places that don't have it. And we have a new program called the Affordable Connectivity Program that's providing a subsidy, a monthly subsidy for those who can't afford it. And so now it's about how do we reach those households? How do we make it easy for them to sign up? And how do we get them over the finish line?
I understand that when you started the project, fiber was the main technology to connect schools, but now we're talking about 5G. We have high-speed satellites as well. Do you believe that this technology, these new technologies, can make things easier for countries like Brazil to reach to provide good connectivity to the schools?
Yeah, look, I think there's a role for all of these technologies. If I were in charge, what I would say is any place we can affordably put fiber, we should put fiber. It's just, it grows fast. It has the ability to grow with the needs just in a way that the wireless technologies don't. I think satellite technology will be very useful, particularly in very rural areas. I mean, that's what we're seeing in the United States, that very rural areas where it's just cost prohibitive to build other things, to build fiber is where that technology should be used. And then 5G is going to be interesting. So for 5G, the reality is we have to get fiber out to the cell sites anyway. So once you've got 5G to the cell sites, then it can be a question of is it yes. better and more cost effective to get to a specific building with 5G versus just extending the fiber a little bit further. I don't think anybody really knows yet what 5G is capable of. I mean, we all seen the theoreticals, right? But until you put it in and you have 500 students in a building all trying to use the internet at the same time, and you see what the latency impacts are and how loaded the network is, it's going to be hard to know whether that's the right solution for schools, but it's certainly a tool in the tool bag.
Fantastic. And now I see that you're an expert in education and connected education. So I would ask you, besides affordability and coverage, and you also mentioned awareness, what would you point that is important to have in mind when we are discussing public policies for education, contents, skills, what else?
Well, I think the first thing is this has to be a public-private partnership. No one group, the schools can't get it done on their own, the nonprofit sector can't get it done on their own, the government can't get it done on their own, and the ISPs can't get it done on their own. They all have to come together and they all have an important role to play. The second thing I would say is transparency of information is critical. If we all don't know who needs to be upgraded, we're not going to get there. If we all don't know what things should cost, we're not going to get the schools the bandwidth that they need. And so transparency is important. And then the third thing is we really do have to understand that the schools need help. They don't know what they're doing. They don't have the resources internally to manage these complicated procurement processes and technological management and things like that. So we have to do all of those things. And then once we've got the internet in place, we have to help schools think through what are the best ways to use this in education? Because just like they don't really know how to get the internet in, early on, they're not going to know what the best ways to use the internet are to advance education in Brazil.
Fantastic. Ivan, thank you very much for your participation for this brief interview. Of course, we are still learning about this and discussing about this, and we are going to call you again to discuss any other project that you may have, because I believe that it's very important to share your knowledge and your experience with the Brazilian audience. So thank you very much for participating at this interview.
Well, thanks for having me. It's thrilling to see Brazil taking this on, and I'll just leave you with the following, which is that this is a solvable problem. And it is a win-win for everybody. And so I encourage you to put your hearts and your backs and your shovels into it. And Brazil and Brazil's students will really be better off.
Thank you very much, and congratulations for your initiative. Very inspirational. Great. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.